if you're estimating your construction projects and remodel projects based off feeling or your gut instinct or about how long you think something should take, there's a pretty good chance you're losing thousands of dollars. Today, we're going to be talking about estimates, proposals, and how you should be using data over time that you collect to make your estimates more accurate and more complete. Obviously, when you're first starting, sometimes you have to do a little bit of guessing, but today we're going to tell you how over time you should be using data and all the things that you learn on every estimate to make your estimates more accurate. Chris, how are you doing today?
Good, brother. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So tell me a little bit about this. You obviously run a pretty good size outdoor living space company, and your estimates have a lot of detail to them. So tell me a little bit about your thoughts about this. How do you make sure that your estimates are accurate and clean and include everything?
Yeah. So, for us, when we go to an actual estimate, we're going through a design phase first. Especially most of our projects are, $75,000 and up. So we're not just going to say, hey, this is that.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to go through, we're a completely submodel. So we're going to build out the design. Our design, we handle that in-house. We're going to go through the entire layout. We're going to pick all the selections. We're going to pick all the materials. We're going to pick all the features that they want, anything like that. And then we'll start with building a material list and building a scope of work. And then we'll take that scope of work, send it out to our subcontractors, get bids in writing that they sign off on, bring those back, and then we can build our proposal there.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my first questions is, for clarification for the folks listening, have you always been an entirely subcontractor model, or were you using employees at one point?
Oh no, we had employees for a while. At my biggest, I had 37 in-house.
So how does this change when you're looking at estimating for your own crews versus getting subcontractors? I know you and I have had these conversations about subs being a little bit more consistent. So tell the listeners how you do that.
Yeah. So honestly, it tends to be a lot easier to estimate because once you have a subcontractor agreement in place and you have a culture where they know if they give you a price, they're expected to honor it. And if they miss something, that's on them. As long as it was clearly part of the scope, right? Unforeseeable things or things that weren't included in the scope or change orders, we don't expect them to just cover that. But if I give you a deal that says you're going to build a 16 by 36 deck, here's the plans, you can see the breaker boards, you can see how the patterns are, you can see it's listed out the railing and the materials and all that. Well, if you didn't account for something, that's on you. And so you have to eat that labor. And so really for us, it became a lot tighter of an estimating process.
Mm-hmm.
It does end up being a little bit more expensive. So either A, you're going to have a slightly lower close rate if you can't sell at that higher price point, or B, you'll have to have a little bit lower margin. But what we have found is when you have that tight estimate from a sub, then you don't have nearly as much slippage because you can't say, okay, well, my 3-man crew should be able to get this done in 4 days and it ended up taking 6.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm guessing a lot of the people listening struggle with is when you're first starting in business. I know my experience was, how many times did you say, oh, I can do this in 3 days, so my crew should be able to do it in 3 days, and then it ends up taking 4 or 5 or 6. And I felt like I was a lot more detailed and specific when I had subs versus employees.
Yeah, so two things. When you have in-house people, one, sometimes you are just going to guess. But that's also why we encourage people at the beginning of their journey, at the beginning of their business, all of that, to run a higher profit margin so that if you underestimate how long something takes and the labor ends up going over, you're going from, let's say, a 50% margin maybe down to a 42%. Whereas people who bid at like a 30%, you might be going down to 18% by the time you factor that in because there's just not as much meat left on the bone.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's important to talk about is you hear a lot of these conversations about industry standards for gross margin or gross profit. And obviously when you have a subcontractor model, your gross profit can be a little bit lower because you don't have as many expenses in house. So you hear a lot of people talking about 50% gross profit. And I think that kind of assumes that you have employees because you're paying for trucks, you're paying for equipment, you're paying for tools, you're paying for uniforms. Whereas if you're an entirely subcontractor model, you might make a lower margin, but you have less expenses. So your net margin's still going to be good.
Yeah, and I think the last thing you said there is really what's key. Once you know your numbers, you should be looking to hit a net margin percentage because you should be calculating to hit 10, 15, 18, 20%, whatever that net number that you're shooting for. And then you should be adding in your overhead expenses once you know your numbers. You should know, like, I know in 2026 or 2025 what I spent on marketing, and I can break that down what I paid my marketing guy versus what I spent in ad spend. I can see exactly how many leads I got based on that ad spend. I can see what our closing rate was. And so realistically, if you have a repeatable process, even with sales, you should be able to say, for every X amount of dollars I put in, I'm going to get a lead. For every lead, every X amount of leads, I'm going to get a sale. Which, when you look at average job size, then you can see, okay, literally, this is how much money I need to put in order to get this much return, and then trickle that down. And so it really becomes more of a math game than anything else once you know your numbers.
Yeah, and something interesting I want to ask you about that is, what's your opinion on subcontractor model versus employee model being more scalable? Because I feel like just when you talk about it that way and talking to other people, both clients and colleagues, it seems like once you know your numbers really well, and it really is a copy paste game, like I know I need to spend this much on marketing to get this many leads, to get this many jobs. It's a little bit easier to say, okay, if I'm making 500K and I want to make $1 million, I just double my ad spend and I know I have to spend X to get Y. Whereas with employees, it's the same equation, but you have to also factor in that you're going to have to hire, onboard, and train, buy more trucks, buy more equipment, buy more tools. Do you feel like it's easier to scale a subcontractor model than it is to scale an employee model because of that?
Yes, I do. I think
Yeah.
realistically, and it depends on the kind of person you are too, right? So if your goal is to grow a business as fast as possible with the most amount of margin and the least amount of risk, subcontractor is going to be the way to go. You know, especially with AI and virtual assistants and things of that nature. Like, we're going to do somewhere between 3 and 4 million this year, and maybe including VAs, we'll have 5 employees.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want the folks out there listening, just for context too. I do mostly service calls and service size jobs, so our average ticket is a lot lower than Treese's, but we do about 50% subcontractor versus employees, and I'm starting to see that scalability wise that applies to service too. So I think more of the service guys, like the electricians, the plumbers, the HVAC techs, most of them have mostly in-house employees, it seems like. But for certain businesses in the service industry, if you're doing something like cleaning or pressure washing or window cleaning, subcontractor model isn't off the table for you guys either. It definitely does work. It is a little bit different, but it's worth considering because sometimes you can have tighter margins, cleaner estimating, cleaner budgets, and you can scale faster than if you had to hire and train every single one of those employees that you need.
Yeah, I could see that. Especially with service based, I would just make sure people don't think it's just hire a sub and they do it. You're still going to have to train them, just like VAs, just like when you start working with a new AI model. Like, you have to train it to think the way you want, to do the processes the way you want, to execute the way you want, to look out for things, clean up a certain way, have a certain appearance. Like, regardless of what you do, we do that with our subs. You still have an expectation. You have an appearance expectation. You have a cleanliness expectation. You have a timeliness expectation. You have a behavior expectation.
Yeah. And I think that's almost a whole other video that we should do, is all the ins and outs of dealing with subcontractors, because it is a very good business model, but doing it wrong can put you in just as much trouble as doing it wrong with employees. You still have to have that consistency in those systems and subcontractor agreements and hold people accountable to the expectations you have.
Yeah, 100%.
Awesome. Well, the other big thing I wanted to talk about on this topic is obviously when we're talking about bigger jobs and projects like you do, or remodeling bathrooms and kitchens, larger construction projects, all the way up to whole home builds or additions, things like that. Tell me your thoughts about getting accurate estimates over time as you grow. So the newer you are, the more, I don't want to say guesswork, but a little bit more guessing has to go into it. Tell me more about how over time data changes those decisions for you.
Yeah, so I mean, what you're ultimately talking about is job costing. And you should be job costing at the end of every job. That should be a part of your process that happens no matter what. It should be on the calendar. It should have the necessary people there, whether you're a one-man show and it's just you, or it's you, a project manager, a sales guy, to go through and say, okay, this is where we missed the mark. Because I think the national average for slippage is like 4%. A
That's
lot
that.
of small subs are way over that. A lot of small contractors
Yeah.
are way, way, way over that.
I was going to say, I haven't heard that number before, but that's actually shocking to me. I would have thought the national average is way higher than that.
That was one of my clients actually telling me that, and that was specifically for home builders. And so that
Okay.
might be on the large national scale, the McBride and Sons, the people like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I can see 4% if we're talking about home building. I would hazard a guess that if there was a national standard data available for something like bathrooms and kitchens, it's got to be higher. I mean, that seems really low for at least for smaller companies, maybe for big nationwide companies.
Well, I think that's the difference is when you're talking about that national average, you're looking at there's probably more companies that are smaller, but the big boys do so much more volume that the data is going to skew towards what they do.
Well, and I imagine the people reporting data to those organizations like the National Remodeling, National Home Builders Associations are probably bigger companies. I can't imagine most of the mom and pop small, like a couple houses, couple $1 million a year companies are even reporting their data.
I agree with that.
So over time, whether you're on a subcontractor model or an employee model, we talked a little bit about this in a previous call, but estimated versus actual labor, estimated versus actual materials. A lot of guys just are guessing simply because I think they aren't tracking the data. And over time, you have to collect that data and analyze it both through job costing, through looking at data in your CRM. And over time, you move further away from gut instinct and closer to data driven estimates. But that takes time. It's hard for guys that are newer in business to do that. So what are your thoughts for the folks listening that are in their first 6 months, year, 2 years in business? When you were new or when you work with the clients that are new, how do you suggest they get more specific and more granular with their estimates to try to avoid this mess you can get into?
I mean, being more granular is going to obviously help. You know, you're not just saying, hey, it's $5,000 for this framing package. You're laying down, I need this many 2x4, 6s, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as labor goes, I don't think, like, you obviously want a clear scope of work and you want to think through the time process to do everything, and you want to think about inadvertent trips to the store or material delays or things like that. But I think the only way to truly move from a guess to data driven estimating is to actually job cost, like we talked about. You have to do that at the end of every job. And that's where it becomes really difficult for smaller companies, especially guys who are, you know, by themselves, or they have one or two helpers on site and they're doing all of the admin work themselves. If, let's say I can work 80 hours a week, you're going to get burnt out doing that long term. So we don't obviously want to do that, but let's say we can. Okay, well, if I'm in the middle of season and I'm running on the job 50 hours a week and I've got another 10 hours of miscellaneous running to the store, callbacks, pulling permits, etc. And then I've got another 10 hours for sure of designing projects, putting quotes together, estimating, and then another 10 hours of sales calls, actually being on site with clients. We just put 80 hours in. So what do you take away from in order to job cost? Well, the reality is you probably don't. The reality is you have to do that for long enough to where you have some money and you're pricing with a high enough profit margin in place, so you can build up some capital to hire somebody,
Mm-hmm.
or you take on less of a load, be honest with people that you're further out than what you are right now, extend your lead time and make time for that. But you have to prioritize it, because if you just continue to go and shoot numbers from the hip, you might grow your top line revenue, but if you don't know what your profit is, you might be doing it for none.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that always comes to mind with this whole kind of overall topic is it's it's hard to be extraordinarily accurate and break out the details and break out all the individual little minutia in estimates when you're in a hurry to do them. And at least in my experience, I know a lot of the mistakes that I made when I was newer was because I was working 80 hours a week, and because I didn't have help, and because I was in a rush to get proposals out to people. I mean, I can think of a couple of just absolutely ridiculous mistakes I made. One specifically that comes to mind cost me almost $10,000, and it was a client that I worked with for over a month to do an estimate for a really nice custom deck. It was almost 1,800 square feet. It was multi-level, and we looked at wood, like just regular cedar. We looked at a lower range composite, a middle range composite, a higher range composite, and the most expensive estimate was TimberTech AZEK. Well, we originally signed a contract for the TimberTech AZEK line, and we had the estimate really dialed in for that exact material. Then, about a month before we started, they told me they wanted to lower the budget a little bit. So what we ended up doing was lowering the budget down to a middle range composite. I can't remember the exact line, but it was a few dollars less per linear foot. Re-signed the contract. We did a whole new contract instead of a change order because it was such a large change. And then, like 2 weeks before the project, a few weeks later, they decided to change back to the higher end material. Well, we signed a change order and we adjusted the material cost, but nobody went back into our CRM and adjusted the materials cost on the actual electronic proposal, just in the contract. So we made it through the whole project, made it through the whole thing. And at the end of the project, after having collected the final invoice and going back and comparing numbers and job costing, I realized they had only been billed and invoiced for the middle range composite and not for the change back to the higher end material. So they ended up paying $8,000 or $9,000 plus tax less than they would have because of that multiple change orders, multiple contract changes. It was a little bit of a mess, obviously, but it was just me working in the office at that time. I didn't have an office assistant, didn't have a VA, didn't have a salesman. So I was not only managing field operations, I was doing all the paperwork on the back end. And fortunately, this client was awesome. And I went out and sat down with them, talked to them, explained what happened, and they wrote me a check for the difference. But there's a lot of times that if you did something like that and it wasn't on paper and it wasn't signed correctly, that mistake could cost you that $10,000 and you would never get it back.
Yeah,
And
it's
simply an admin mistake, but a simple admin mistake in contracting can cost you a lot of money. So, Have you ever had something like that happen? Can you think of a time that you like a tiny mistake cost you a ton of money?
Oh, I mean, it happens all the time, man. Nothing specific comes to mind, but yeah, I've done it a lot over the years.
Yeah, I think everybody has at some point, and I think that goes back into the systems of estimating, of having a clear system for how you handle change orders, how you handle material changes, how you handle additional work. And it's hard because it's so easy to make mistakes like that if you don't have clear systems in place.
Yeah, for sure.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Change orders as a whole is something that we're going to talk about probably in a follow-up video, but short and sweet, the short version. How do you recommend people that are newer handle change orders?
What do you mean?
So when newer guys first start, a lot of times you see them throw things in for free, or they say, yeah, we can do that for XYZ dollars, but they don't sign a contract, they don't adjust the scope of work. I mean, I guess for those listening, somebody like you who's further along in the game, when a client says, hey, I want to add this or I want to change that, what does that process look like to make sure it's accounted for, billed for, signed, approved? How do you handle that?
So for us, all change orders are written. They have to be signed on We also have it in our scope of work that if bit material affects production, so if you wait till the last minute, we have a service fee for that.
Mm-hmm.
Side note, that is the only time that I use the word be in my business because I want you to know that it's a negative thing.
Mm-hmm.
But we specifically call it out because I've had people that are like the morning of, hey, can we change the color on this? Even if it's a stock item, yeah, now I've got to go back to the store and we charge for our time, but I also charge, okay, well, now I have to take time to estimate. So my guys are going to be sitting there for 2 or 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a $250, $500, $1,000 change order fee depending on the effect it has on our production. But yeah, everything has to get estimated. Everything has to get proposed and signed off on. And we actually collect 100% of our change orders up front. So if it's a $10,000 change order, you're giving me 100% of it as soon as we sign.
Yeah, it's they're writing a check along with signing the change order. It's not like we're going to add it to the final invoice. It's right there.
Yeah,
yeah. We had the same policy because it's such an inconvenience, and I kind of agree with you. I mean, it sounds bad to a lot of people, but I think that it's not a bad thing for your customers to see change orders as a negative, in my opinion. Obviously, people want what they want, but if you're working with a tier of client that can afford it, then if they want it, then they can pay for it. If you're giving too much and being too convenient, you're going to end up with lots of problems in production with people changing this little thing here and this little thing there, and all of that adds up to a huge slippage in production efficiency, and it does impact your business and how well your estimate actually happens. If there's 10 little changes that cost you a few hours here and a few hours there, it adds up quick.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
So I think that we're ready to kind of wrap up on this. At the end of the day, the estimates in your business are a little bit challenging. And when you're first starting, you are going to have to guess a little bit. But the longer you get into your business, the more that data collected needs to affect your estimates. So if you're not job costing, like Treese said, job costing is the first step. Collecting data over time of how long it actually takes your guys, whether they're employees or subcontractors, to do something is going to make things more consistent. And if you're an entirely sub model, then obviously getting more specific with your subcontractors, having things in writing that keeps them accountable, and making sure that you're not slipping in margin because subs or employees miss something or take longer or have issues, will over time make sure that your estimated margin and your estimated rates actually are what happens over the long haul. So we're going to do a more in-depth video series on estimating at some point in the future, but we really wanted to give you guys the big picture overview of this whole concept because it's something that so many guys struggle with. So if this is something that you need help with and that you're working on, jump into our Facebook group or send us a DM and ask us about it. It's definitely something that a lot of people struggle with, not just new people, but there's lots of people that are 3, 5, 10 years into business that still have issues with this. So if you need help with it, reach out to us. Come join our Facebook community. You can talk to other contractors that are dealing with this. We talk about estimates and proposals pretty regularly because it's something that everybody works through on a regular basis. If you'd like to work with us, reach out to us, and we are more than happy to help with this and anything else you're working on in your business.